Good morning, everyone, and thank you for your time this morning. I'd briefly just like to introduce AUARA to you as a collection and a collaboration of Australian university researchers whose passion is about making a difference for children, and particularly around bullying and cyberbullying, and working with evidence base to inform policy and practice. So this is who we are. We're educators, psychologists, academics, lawyers and researchers. We cover fields of social aggression, bullying, cyberbullying, mental health, wellbeing and children's peer relationships. We came together because we saw a gap to inform policy and practice through using evidence-based research, because we're passionate about improving the outcomes for young people in the areas of bullying and cyberbullying. We've come together under the banner of Working Together, a Community in Harmony. This whole conference is about building community partnerships, and we have forged our own partnerships in community, and we're going to share some of that with you today. So the outline is Professor Marilyn Campbell will speak to us about what is a community in harmony. Dr. Grace Skripiak will talk about the difference between bullying and aggression and the implications for wellbeing. Professor Des Butler will be, he has pre-prepared a video for us and then he will come in at the end. Professor Phillips Lee will talk about translating research to policy and practice, and then I will finish up with a very brief outline of the newly released Australian Student Wellbeing Framework, which will form the basis of the consultations that we're working on tomorrow. So it's with great pleasure that I invite Professor Marilyn Campbell to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you. I love it when people acknowledge you first, so that if you bomb out, then you don't feel so bad about it. I actually didn't really do what I was told to do, is my want, because I don't think we actually have a community in harmony. And in fact, I don't really know that we have communities at all anymore. So, first of all, for me, I think it's about us always saying about the school. So hands up if you're connected with schools. Thank you. And you do know that schools raise children with a little bit of help from their parents. Because that's what it seems like to me at the moment. It's about, well, we've got an overcrowded curriculum and, look, we have to teach road safety and we have to teach computer safety and we have to teach about stranger danger. Now, look, CPR is really important as well. So everything seems to be loaded on the school. And we say a school community, but I'm not sure that everybody working in schools actually works as a school community. And I'm not sure when we think of communities anymore. Big green one? I did the big green one. So, the old African proverb is that it takes a village to raise a child. I'm sure Canada and Australia don't look like this. I am sure that we don't have those kind of communities anymore. Unless we live in a small country town, we don't seem to have, in suburbia, a centre where we all go. It doesn't seem to me that we actually have a geographical community anymore, because the nuclear family raises the kids, hopefully with a little bit of help from the school, but we don't have our extended family around us, we don't live with them. I think we've lost a whole lot of sense of community. So when we say that we really want to engage the community, I think what we mean are about different types of our society. So what do we see sometimes, and where kids are brought up in families that have domestic violence? What do we see sometimes when the parents are boardroom bullies? Because we know that bullying is a social relationship problem. It's deeply embedded in our society. We always look on, well, this is about kids, isn't it? Kids bully. Adults bully as well. And because it's so deeply embedded in our society, then what we say is, well, how are we going to change it? Kids will learn from their parents, who are boardroom bullies, bullies at work, that the abuse of power is how you conduct your relationships. Kids who live in families with domestic violence can see how bullying occurs. So that's our society in raising kids. So our society, not necessarily community, is about government, is about the federal government, it's about the state government, and sometimes I know in the Queensland Task Force that a lot of the consultations that we did, people said, well, the politicians bully, so how do you expect the kids? I actually don't think that they bully according to that definition, but they do show sometimes disrespectful behaviour. And then our society, we have the police, who can only do something when the Parliament makes the law that they can enforce. We do have religious institutions that helped bring up kids, but they seem to be shrinking in their influence over kids. So when I was a kid, even if your parents weren't particularly of a particular faith, you still got sent to Sunday school because that was the norm. Everybody just got sent to Sunday school. Whereas I think that the institution in our society of the churches has waned. And also, we have loads of, obviously in Canada, it's much more prevalent to have the Scouts and Girl Guides than it is here, because they are also shrinking. We used to have Boys Brigade, Girls Brigade. There were lots of societal institutions that helped raise kids, and I'm not sure that they have as much influence anymore. But, on the other hand, our sporting teams have a lot of influence. Loads of kids play competition sport on the weekends, and that's one part of the community that I think we really need to engage with, because sometimes what happens on the weekend on a Saturday afternoon can flow through on Monday, which means that people in school spend all Monday trying to sort out incidents about bullying that have happened on the weekend. So, we also have, as a very powerful influence of our society, about the media. And you all know how they promoted these bullying episodes on MKR. We know that shock jocks promote that kind of disrespectful behaviour. We know that the press also sensationalises bullying. Facebook and Twitter, even though they have policies against bullying, have platforms which enable kids. I mean, you're not allowed to be on Facebook till you're 13. So what do? You just lie. So there's no validation, because of privacy. We can't do. Privacy is much more important. So they don't even come. They come with the lowest settings, don't they? So unless you know, as a parent, to up the settings, you're going to get the lowest one. So I've already talked about Dolly's dream. the Bullying No Way, the Ilana and Madeline Foundation. All of these people are trying, they're well-intentioned, they're trying to do the best that they can, but we are all doing it in silos. And we are all taking different approaches, and we are not discussing as a society and as a community because we really don't have a good blueprint. We really aren't truly engaging with parents when they come to the school. Oh, she's going to complain about her kids got bullied and he was fighting, and she won't understand that he was fighting and starting all of these things. We're not really engaging with them. We need to engage with the law. We need to understand the law. There are plenty of laws for any kind of bullying, but do we want to criminalise children? The police can only enforce the law. We need to engage social media. And what we need is an honest conversation. So, were you brought up with sticks and stones will break your bones, but words will never hurt you? And so, toughen up, build a bridge, get over it, pull your socks up, walk away, ignore it. But now, do we put our kids in bubble wrap? Do we cotton wool kids? Do we have helicopter and lawnmower parenting? Are we trying to keep our kids too safe? How can they be resilient if they can't solve their own problems? So on the one hand, we're saying, be resilient, but help seek. What? Are we confused in our messaging? Because I certainly am. And I'm sure that the kids are too. But we're not having those discussions in the community. We're not having those discussions in school. Do you think the kids are being too bubble wrapped? Do you think that they should sort out their own problems? Or every single problem, should they tell us and should we fix it? We haven't had those discussions, and I think we need to. Lastly, we also need to hear student voice. Even though PrevNet works with adults, and we would prefer to work with adults, because I think if we change the adult society, then we won't have this deeply embedded problem that we are passing down from generation to generation. We can't just start with the kids, we've got to start with the adults, but we also have to listen to the kids and realise how much their peer relationships mean to them. Thank you.
How do I sort this out? Hi, I'm Grace Skripiak, and there's going to be a bit of a change of gear here. My background is in measurement and statistics, so that's what you're going to see. Found it. I don't know whether you are aware that there isn't a definition associated with bullying. That bullying is the competent presence of three criteria. For a person to be referred to as having been bullied, they need to have experienced some negative behaviour that was intentionally harmful, that was repeated, so they experienced it more than once, and that involved a power differential between the victim and the bully, so that the victim didn't feel that they could respond. This is the definition that we have in the academy. So if I am going to do some research, this is the definition I would use to identify whether or not a young person has been bullied. But this isn't what I expect that teachers would think about when someone comes to you and says, I was bullied. You're not going to stop and say, well, wait a minute. Did you feel like you could respond to them? Do you feel like there's a power imbalance? Has this happened before? Do you think it was intentional? And so there was some research that was conducted about 10 years ago by Tracy Valancourt in Canada, And what she found was that young people don't think about bullying in this way, and they don't think about bullying in the same way that academics do. So there's a discord in the way that academics see bullying and the way that kids see it at school. What they do know is that they've been hurt. So they will go and tell someone, a friend probably, more likely than a teacher for sure, that they've been bullied because they've been hurt. And so researchers now around the world are starting to say, well, maybe we should be rethinking how we approach bullying. The problem we have in the academy is that once a definition is there, it's there. You can't really change the definition of bullying. So I've been doing research where I'm looking at the harm that young people report from negative behaviours with their peers. So there's a questionnaire that asks them, did this happen to you? Were you teased? Did somebody exclude you? Did you do it to someone else? And then I ask, how harmful was it to you? Do you think it was deliberate? Has it happened before? Has something similar happened before? Do you feel that you were not able to respond, that there was a power differential? So looking at the definition, looking at every element within that definition and asking young people to describe their experiences according to that criteria. And in doing so, what we found was that, oops, that's the wrong one. How do I go back? The red one. Is there a pointer? The green one in the middle, that one. Ah, okay. So when we asked young people about their experiences, the negative behaviours they'd experienced with their peers, we actually found that just over 1/4 reported that they were not maltreated in any way. They didn't engage in any kind of negative behaviour. And this is data that we collected from 11 countries, including Australia, with 7,000 kids. And roughly the same proportion, just over 1/4, said that while they did engage in negative behaviour, it wasn't harmful. It was just harmless banter. It's the way that kids were communicating with each other. We had stories where kids were saying, oh, when I go home and saying goodbye to my friend, I say to her, I hope you get killed by a bus, or, you know, go kill yourself, and things like that. And that's supposed to be funny, and they say it to each other, and it's not taken seriously, according to the young people in the survey. So that's about 55% of the young people that we surveyed across the world said that they weren't actually harmed by their peers. There were some that said they were unintentionally harmed, but that proportion is quite small. Some that only were harmed once in a period of 3 months, but there was a significant proportion, just under 1/4, about 1 in 5, who said that they were repeatedly, intentionally harmed, but they didn't feel that there was a power imbalance. That means they weren't bullied, according to the academics. And then there was a similar proportion who said that they were bullied, that meant that they were intentionally harmed repeatedly and that they didn't feel that they could respond in a way to defend themselves because the person was more powerful than them. So from this data, we can see that there is a significant proportion of young people who are harmed by their peers, but actually we can't identify them as having been bullied. But I think that in schools and in our communities, we don't distinguish between the repeatedly, intentionally harmed and the bullied. We don't really distinguish them. If a young person comes to us and tells us that they've been bullied, we don't ask the question about power imbalance or even repetition. But in academia, when we do measurements to see whether or not an intervention has worked, these things become important. So in looking at the harm that the young people reported, we have definite findings that show that being bullied is the most harmful form of peer aggression, without question. If you have a look at this graph, these are the confidence intervals, those eyes, I guess you could call them. You can see that there's no overlap between this group, which is the victims of repeated aggression, and this group, which are the victims of bullying. There's no overlap. So there's a clear distinction in the harm that's experienced by young people when there is the presence of a power imbalance. But That being said, there's still a significant group who report being harmed. And so, when we looked at these two groups, the groups that were bullied and the groups that were repeatedly and intentionally harmed, what we found was that they were comparable in size almost. In every single country that we looked at, we found that there was a group of bullied students and a comparable group of repeatedly, intentionally harmed students. Oops, my message about my conclusion is gone, so I'll just have to tell you what my conclusion is. So my conclusion from all of this is that the thing that all students across the board have in common is that they've been harmed in some way. And that's what I think we should focus on. Even in our measurements, before we do an intervention, rather than asking, were you bullied, we should ask, were you harmed by a peer? We can then work out to what degree that harm was, and then focus on that. What kind of support does an individual need when they say that they've been harmed by a peer? It doesn't really matter if it was repeated or if there was a power imbalance, although we know that with those elements, the harm is worse. And I think that what we need to be aware of, because I haven't got the findings here, but is that the harm that's caused through peer aggression erodes resilience. We have evidence of that. And it also erodes self-confidence and self-concept. And they are the two elements that then impact well-being. So by focusing on harm, we can then think about how we build resilience, how we build self-concept, and eventually impact well-being so it's positive. And our young people can flourish the way that we want them to. Okay?
Thank you, Grace. I don't know what happened to that slide. We're now going to see a video prepared by Professor Des Butler, and Des is listening from Queensland, and then he'll join us at the end. So let's see if we can get this to work.
Hi, I'm Des Butler. I'm a Professor of Law here at QUT in Brisbane. Sorry I'm not able to join you in person today, but I'm glad I've had the opportunity to speak to you via technology. I'd like to say a few words about the role of policing and legal communities when it comes to bullying. A starting point is this question. Do we need a specific law that prohibits bullying, or Libby's law, as it's called by some? It's perfectly understandable by someone who's been the target of bullying, their family or other people, would want to look to the law as an instrument of the state and higher authority as a way of addressing the power imbalance between the bully and the target that Grace talked about. It would be nice if that was the simple answer to what's a complex problem. But there's a number of reasons why our team, AUARA, suggests that enacting a specific anti-bullying law is not the answer. First off, simply banning something doesn't stop it from happening. There's laws against speeding, but that doesn't stop people from speeding. And when we focus on bullying, we're talking about generally immature young people. There's laws against underage sex, but that doesn't stop some young people from engaging in that behaviour. And the fact that we are, in many cases, dealing with acts of immature people is the second reason. However we define bullying, and that's another problem in itself, since different researchers use different definitions, do we really want to criminalise the acts of children when there may be other measures that can be used that can be more effective? The law is a very blunt instrument to wield as the primary response to bullying. Now, that's not to suggest that the law doesn't have a role to play in extreme cases, but it's worth keeping in mind these words from the English Court of Appeal. There's no magic in the term bullying. In other words, the focus of the law is on the conduct, not on the label. So when we think about what bullies do, we can see that we already have laws that can be applied in extreme cases of bullying where appropriate. There's not been many cases of bullying that have reached the courts, but in this one, the bully tried to screw a towel down the throat of the target, amongst other things. But if that was the only thing that happened, we wouldn't need it to be repeated, which is a requirement in many definitions of bullying, for us to call it for what it was, assault. And all states and territories already have laws against assault. If instead we think about what cyberbullies do, well, they misuse the telecommunication system, whether it be the telephone or the internet, to intimidate or harass their targets. And we already have a law against that. It's section 474.17 of the Commonwealth Criminal Code. And that makes it an offence to use the telecommunications system to menace, harass or cause offence. And it's punishable by 3 years imprisonment. That section is backed by other sections in the Criminal Code which prohibit the use of the telecommunications system, including the internet, to threaten to kill or to cause serious harm, and to use the carriage service for child abuse material. And that includes videoing someone being assaulted and then posting that video online. The only problem with those sections is that they're in a Commonwealth statute, and it can get a bit wibbly-wobbly because the federal police are not orientated towards community policing. And that's really what's needed in extreme cases of bullying. That's more the job of state and territory police, which is why it's important to know that we have existing laws at a state and territory level that may be relevant. For example, in South Australia, we have Section 19AA of the Criminal Law Consolidation Act, which prohibits stalking. And that involves a person, on at least 2 occasions, engaging in one of the prescribed forms of behaviour that are listed in the section, with the intent to cause serious physical or mental harm or serious apprehension or fear. Now, the list of behaviour includes following a person, loitering outside a person's home, and this: communicating with another person or about another person by means including the telephone or the internet or some other form of electronic communication in a manner that could reasonably be expected to arouse apprehension or fear, or acting in another way that could reasonably be expected to arouse the other person's apprehension or fear. You might see some similarities between that offence and the elements that Grace mentioned just before. There are other existing offences that can apply to extreme cases of bullying, although there are some differences between the states and territories. Once you look at stalking and these other offences and return to our original question, do we need a law prohibiting bullying? I think you can see that we already have laws that prohibit bullying behaviour. What we do need is better education of all elements of the community: young people, parents, schools, police and policymakers, of the existing laws against bullying, and a greater willingness to call on these in extreme cases. Now, that's not to suggest that there isn't work to be done. There are, as I said, differences in the laws in different states and territories, some quite significant. For example, the anti-vilification laws in South Australia have major shortcomings when compared to those in, for example, Queensland. There's even differences in the stalking offences around the country, which, as we saw, is the offence that resembles research and definitions of bullying. So, it's our view at AUARA that we don't need to enact a new law specifically prohibiting bullying in the hope that such a law will end bullying. We do need to recognise there are many other measures that can address bullying more effectively. Nevertheless, we do need to recognise that there are already existing laws that are available in extreme cases. But we do need to harmonise those laws to remove these sometimes significant inconsistencies. We need to better educate all members of the community about existing laws, some of whom may be saying that we need a law against bullying without realising that we already have some. And finally, we need a willingness to apply those laws in cases where it's appropriate.
Thank you, Des. I know you're listening. We'll get to you shortly. Des, we can see you, but we can't hear you.
Hello, can you hear me now?
We can.
Excellent. I can't see you, but that's good that you can see me.
Okay. We're going to move on with the rest of the presentation. We'll come back to the end.
I'll be here.
Okay, thank you. Are you sliding that through? I call on Professor Philip Slee now. Thank you.
Hello everyone. You're all looking bright-eyed and bushy-tailed for this time in the morning on a Monday. I was really heartened by what the Minister had to say this morning and what I perceived as his commitment to this area. I'm also heartened by the fact that you're along here and we have such a high proportion of teachers and educators, as well as allied healthcare workers and young people attending. When we initially sat down as a group, AUARA, Australian Universities Anti-Bullying Research Alliance, and we talked about, with the department, about what we were intending to do, we had deliberately looked at the idea of a community in harmony. And I think Marilyn has challenged us to think about whether or not we're a community at all. Grace has raised significant issues around the harm that comes about as a result of bullying. And Des has talked about the issue of law. So I'm going to pick up on some of those themes now very quickly, if I can make the magic green button happen. Okay. No, it went backwards. Did it? No. Oh, yes. Okay. Wendy this morning talked about evidence-based practice. And I am a strong advocate of evidence-based practice. I think that's what is needed to inform our classroom teaching, our relationships within the community, etc. There is also a body of evidence called practice-based evidence, and I think that comes about as accumulation. It accumulates as a result of our experiences in working in classrooms, in working in our community together. But there are tensions, and I just want to draw attention to some of these tensions that exist in bringing us together. So my intention, and Des talked about it earlier, is to kind of bridge a gap here. We can talk about researchers and policy makers and practitioners, And we can talk about the kinds of tensions that exist amongst those three groups. If we're going to harmonise, I think we have to think about these three groups and how we can bring a collected voice together. Science really is focused on what we don't know, and Grace raised some of those things about issues around definition of bullying. Social policy and delivery of human services are focused on what we should do. It's about acting and getting out there and doing something. Scientists are interested in questions. They're interested in hypotheses. Policymakers and practitioners are interested in answers. What do I do when a child comes to me and says that this is what happened to me in the playground at recess time? Scholars embrace complexity, just love complexity. Policymakers demand simplicity. Simplicity is a good way to go because it gives us quick, short answers that we can deliver on the spot after recess. Scientists suggest that we stop and reflect. Service providers, like the Education Department, are expected to act. So you can see that the stage is all set here for some reasonable degree, I think, of disharmony. So we could look at this in terms of three cultures. The culture of science. Practitioners are interested in theory building, hypothesis testing and research. Then we've got the culture of policy. Practitioners are driven by political, economic and social imperatives. This 4-year election cycle, for example. As far as the culture of policy is concerned, science is but one point of view, and it's often not the most influential. The culture of practice is where clinical judgment or professional experience is valued, and I really do strongly believe that we need to highly value the experience of teachers in the classroom working day by day with young people. We also need to value student voice. Marilyn talked about student voice, and Barbara will follow on with some of that later. The issue of the culture of practice is that it may not be based at all on scientific evidence. In fact, it may not bear any relation to the kind of policy imperatives and developing policy imperatives of it all. It's based on what do I know as a practitioner? What has been my experience in teaching and in the classroom for X number of years? So these are the three tensions. And I think the value of a conference like this is an opportunity, and I applaud the department in relation to this. This is about bringing all of us together in a collective way to have a discussion about the issues that are part of our everyday life in the classroom and working with young people. So moving on from there, that all said, I can have as much knowledge as I want, but unless it's integrated with the knowledge that exists out there in the community, and Marilyn talked about the community being made up of sporting groups, a really powerful influence in our culture, as we all know, made up of service clubs and church groups and parent groups. Unless we integrate what we know in order to bring that together, in order to understand the nature of human development, and unless it's based on this constructed knowledge and that co-construction that Wendy talked about this morning, to develop a sustained and ethical action that advances all civil society. There is a saying that you're probably familiar with, and it goes something along the lines of, to every complex problem, there is a simple solution, and it's invariably wrong. And I think that's part of the value of a conversation today and tomorrow with groups, where we can bring together our perceptions, bring together our culture, and we can think about how we can emerge from this as stronger as a community. I think that's the really important part of an opportunity such as this. The issue that Wendy talked about this morning in the keynote is really about how do we take what we know from our experience in the classroom, how do we take what we know from our experience with our research, and how do we translate it into evidence-based practice. And Wendy talked this morning about iatrogenic effects. Just because a package comes across your desk with rainbows and baby lambs skipping across green fields and smiley faces doesn't mean that that program is actually going to help. And 15% of the Canadian programs had an iatrogenic effect, do more harm than good. I love organic gardening. I grow lots of herbs in my garden, but I don't ever mistake the fact that that herb can do me will do me no harm. I'm very careful with my gardening and how I go about using herbs, because I know that unless I am aware of the program and, in this case, the cooking that I'm doing and what I'm using in that cooking, the tummy will feel it. So, Wandersman has said, if we keep on doing what we have been doing, we'll keep on getting what we have been getting. There is no doubt with people such as yourself in a room here and in this conference that we need to move this field forward in the policy area, in the practice area. Those are significant areas to move it ahead in. Any effective anti-bullying interventions, unless there is integrity to it, there's verification of it in terms of fidelity and dosage and quality, then we're not going to advance that field in a scientific fashion. So that field of translational research is there as part of that. When we're picking up a program to run in our classrooms, and it's a new program, there is a process to move through that research suggests this through my research with Kids Matter Early Childhood, Kids Matter Primary and Mind Matters. I know that there is a way of taking the evidence that exists in the community and in the research that we've got and translating it so that there is not an iatrogenic effect. We know that average programs well implemented are 2 to 3 times more effective than the best programs poorly implemented. So quality of implementation, fidelity, dosage and quality, how true are we to that program, how many lessons per week, how often should those lessons occur, that translates into quality outcomes. And Kids Matter Primary had some quality outcomes. Kids Matter Early Childhood had quality outcomes. So to finish with, conducting interventions in the complex world of schools is challenging. Elements of successful interventions include establishing relationships, engaging all stakeholders and looking towards sustaining these programs that work in our classroom. So, I want to move now to, if we're going to act on what we know here in this next couple of days, what and how can we do that? Malcolm Gladwell, I really enjoy Gladwell's writing. He said there are 3 principles for us creating some social change. The law of the few. In the room, we have the few. You don't need the many. When you've got passionate, dedicated professionals, parents and carers wanting to make some change, that's the few. You need a memorable message, the stickiness of the message to get across to the politicians, to the policy makers, what we want them to know. And then the power of the context, the influence of the environment versus individual matters. Now is the right moment. Gladwell talks about it being the right moment. And I think that these next 2 days, as Marilyn talked about, there's something in the water happening, maybe in Queensland. They have funny water up there that doesn't make its way down here. No, don't go there. Fine. There may be something in the water, but there is a change. There seems to be a force for change at the moment, and you're part of that force for change. So, what I'm encouraging you to do is go forth from here, develop that memorable, evidence-based message. Understand the political context of that message and how you can cut through the rubbish that exists, and then try to influence leadership and policymakers. Thanks very much, everyone.
Boy, this is a whistle-stop tour, isn't it? You're getting a bit of everything, and I hope there's a message here for every single one of you that is different to every single other person's message, because what a ripple that would make if we all took different messages and put them out there in different ways to create change. This brings me to the newly released Australian Student Wellbeing Framework. Some of you may have been aware of the previous National Safe Schools Framework, which was the national overarching wellbeing focus. This is the newest version. Now, the whole consultation day tomorrow is going to be framed around this new framework. So I'm just briefly going to share with you part of the process as to how we got there and what it is about. So the context for us is that this has been going on for a long time. You can see there in 1994 there was a House of Representatives report on violence in schools, and Professor Philip Slee was involved with that. Then over the time we developed the 2003 National Safe Schools Framework. This was a world-leading integrated framework for the prevention of violence and bullying and other aggressive behaviours. Since then, we have refined it and had various additions, and we have got to 2018 and we have revised it again to reflect contemporary schooling communities and practices around leadership, inclusion, student voice, partnerships and support. Just briefly show you some of the different messages that have been coming through each one of these over the past few years. You will see that there is a consistent message about schools being safe. Schools are the safe haven for many children that are not safe elsewhere, and we must never lose sight of that. So we are now at the 2018 version, where the message and the vision is that Australian schools provide positive relationships and the wellbeing of students and educators within safe, inclusive and connected learning communities. The review and update of the previous edition into this edition took 12 months. So we worked through a co-design, a participatory design process, where we worked with young people, stakeholders, governments. We worked through review and refinement. We took it to the Education Council. They have now endorsed it and released it, and now it's going to be engaging the community as of next year completely. So in 2019 it will be delivered to all schools in the country, and every state minister has signed off and approved of it as meeting the requirements of their particular education focus. These were the guiding questions that we used to inform the process. What is the awareness, knowledge and use of the National Safe Schools Framework? Well, we found that not many people did know about it, not many people actually used it. What do stakeholders think about the usability, relevance, currency, scope, language and terminology? In a nutshell, we've moved on. We needed to be more contemporary. How well does the National Safe Schools Framework align with contemporary social, technological and cultural issues facing school communities? And each time we've done this, we have been able to see the shift and see how that socio-techno-cultural shift has been occurring around us. What do stakeholders recommend that we should consider and address and incorporate? And there were some very clear recommendations that arose out of that. And what needs to be addressed to ensure its sustainability and relevance to everyone. The approach we used was a co-design approach. So we had a participatory design process, we used mixed methodologies, we had surveys, interviews, focus groups and document analysis. So we looked at a lot of other documents around wellbeing and safety to come up with a revised and updated version. I won't bore you with these details, but you can see that this is the approach we used, and the first thing to do was to identify what is the problem. So what is the problem with the current version, and then identify the magnitude and who that's affecting, and then move into co-designing the newest version. When we looked at all of the documents around health and wellbeing, some very clear contemporary issues emerged. Obviously wellbeing and safety. Technology was important. The notion of social and school connectedness became quite significant, and that whole area of connectedness to community, connectedness to family, connectedness through technology, connectedness to school. Relationships and respect were fundamental. Help seeking emerged as an important area for us to think about. How do we encourage young people to seek help when there are problems? The notion of a school climate and the positive school climate and the impact that that can have on students' safety and well-being. Of course, exploring whole school approaches. Everyone is part of the solution. Everyone is part of understanding how to work in prevention and intervention strategies. Within that becomes a tiered approach. We know that we can provide something for everybody, but some young people need a little bit more help or a little bit more targeted intervention. And we know that some young people really do need a lot of support. And so if you imagine a triangle, we're aiming there with those young people to have the most specific support that we can give them. And of course, what's been happening in pedagogies and teaching methodologies? What is the best practice that people are using? I'm not going to bore you with the detail of the data because I said surveys, interviews, student voice and document analysis. This is how the timeline progressed. So you can see that it was a good 12-month project where we were talking to people and doing different things at different times, totally hearing the messages each time. The review and refinement process, though, involved extensive feed-forward and feedback loops, and that's the participatory process. So we would present a draft report. It would go to Education Services Australia, who would then feed it back to us. We'd respond to that. It would then go to the Australian Government Department of Education. We would respond to that. Then it would go to the Safe and Supportive Schools communities, who are the senior policy advisors to every minister in the country, and we would respond to that. And then that draft would be accepted and we'd work on the next one. So there was significant feed forward and feedback. And in the middle of all that, we had expert reviewers also, who looked at it and said, no, this needs tweaking or this needs fixing, and so we had that constant peer review as well. Finally, we got to a revised text and what it might look like, and that was the endorsement that's recently happened. So all of that process led to these recommendations: a new name, a more concise framework. We needed to be addressing contemporary issues such as valuing diversity and promoting inclusion and using the language of those areas. Definitely including student voice, authentic student voice, and the role and use of technology, which is part and parcel of our 24/7 lives. It was also recognised that we needed to have greater alignment with the national, state and territory policies and initiatives. So this is closely aligned with AUARA, the national curriculum, closely aligned with AITSL, the professional standards for teachers and leadership. And we want a greater emphasis on professional learning and ongoing evaluation. And so here is what it looks like. So we had 9 elements in the previous National Safe Schools framework, and we have come down to 5 key pillars, if you like. But the 5 elements provide the foundation for the whole school community to promote student wellbeing, safety and learning outcomes. So we're talking about visible leadership to inspire positive school communities. We're talking about inclusion, inclusive and connected to school culture. Very much about student voice, authentic student participation, where they can actually initiate and drive change in schools, not just give an opinion that adults can veto or choose to pass on. Partnerships, and this is definitely community inspired, those effective family and community partnerships working in concert together. And finally, support. What are the support mechanisms for the wellbeing and support for positive behaviour, so that we can actually enact some change? As I said, a whistle-stop tour for this session, and we've come to 5 minutes to the end. So we are trying very hard to establish that as researchers we can work in harmony and can contribute knowledge, but now it's over to the community to work with us to take that knowledge and to make change. Thank you very much.